Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, there we go. We're awake, at least for now. It's great to be here. Winston, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thanks to you and your team for your hospitality and setting up this great conference. I'd also like to thank Mr. Letty for his friendship over many years and for this inspiring place, Thales Academies. We've known him at the Institute for many years, and it's been a joy and a great inspiration to watch Thales Academies grow, and not only for the academies themselves in this region and in Richmond, hello from fellow Virginian, but also how it's affected the classical education movement around the country. Very inspiring. So thank you for the invitation to be here. At 32 years old, think about how far you are from 32, or maybe you are 32. At 32 years old, Gregory was about to receive major power and authority. Gregory had been well prepared for it. Born into a wealthy family of power and influence, he had received a rigorous classical education that drew on the major traditions of his time in the major languages that were available. Authors in Latin and in Greek, including Augustine, John Cassian, Cassiodorus, and the Desert Fathers. He was surrounded by the built environment of the golden age of classical Rome on the Caelian Hill in the central city, though it was in obvious decay all around him, in contrast to the vibrant architecture of the Christian aristocracy reflected in Jerome's home, a library of the Christian fathers kept by his own grandfather, and several magnificent churches. The influence of Gregory's mother on him and his father was indelible on his character, as was the impression of his aunt, who prayed so fervently, Gregory said, that the skin of her elbows and knees had become calloused and tough. Her dead body bore witness to what her living spirit had been, Gregory wrote in admiration. So though he was only 32, Gregory had already held a few major public offices. Now he had become the mayor of Rome, in addition to being the likely inheritor of several major estates in the city and surrounding countryside. Drawing on his considerable preparation and early achievements, he was now responsible for resolving urban legal disputes, deciding appeals, handling the city's administrative business, supervising the Roman Senate and administrators responsible for the food and water supply of the city, and delivering important speeches at ceremonial occasions. He had arrived as a professional. But after 1 year in this role, he withdrew to private life and became a monk. In his writing, Gregory describes his sense of being overwhelmed by inner conflict, desiring to live a quiet life during a confusing and confounding time, even though he excelled because of his classical education and his family influences. So Gregory retreated. I wonder if we can relate. Whatever your religious convictions or personal commitments, does it ever seem like you're fighting a losing battle? The students just aren't ready to learn. The families aren't supportive enough. We don't see eye to eye on fundamental issues. Our budget is just too tight. We can't seem to provide enough support to our students. If only they had been further along when they enrolled here. If only my personal financial pressures would subside. I'm giving everything I can to my students, but sometimes I'm not even sure I understand what's going on today. Politics seems raucous and hopeless. Will the markets continue to grow? At the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, we study the dynamics that underlie all of these observable effects, the pressures and discomforts that you observe and you experience every day in the classroom. Think of it like the weather and the climate. The weather changes every day. The climate may change in slow, unobservable ways over long periods of time. What we observe today in our politics, or in technology, or in medicine, or in business, what seems new to us today, these changes have been 150 to 200 years in the making. Based on that intellectual genealogy, we at the Institute predicted many of today's dynamics back in 1995. We see today the retreat of religion from the public square. We also see the retreat of objectivity or truth that we can agree on. Worse, there doesn't seem to be any basis on which to arrive at common answers. Is unemployment up or down? Is there climate change or not? Is a fetus a human life or not? Proponents for both sides of these issues don't only scream at each other in disagreement, they don't even see the same reality. They use different language while invoking divergent moral authorities that ring true in their own enclosed communities. If Western civilization has been upheld by the twin pillars of Athens and Jerusalem, by the reason of Athens and the revelation of Jerusalem, we seem to have reached the end of Western civilization. A happy thought for early morning. Our students, like we, inhabit a post-authority civilization. Neither revelation nor reason provides an authoritative basis for agreeing on anything of serious consequence. Perhaps you could discuss this with your students if they would look up from the black mirrors in their hands, or if they would read for extended periods of time or converse with you in more than a couple of sentences. I have 3 teenagers, so I know about this. Or if they would make eye contact, or draw on a literature other than Netflix or Snapchat or Fortnite or Roblox. And for them, the pressure is on to achieve and to perform. So if they're like increasing numbers of students, they may take psychotropic drugs in high school and college to focus, to stay awake, to get all of their studying done so they can compete. Our attention is spread among Facebook posts and Instagram comments and short news articles and snippets of text arriving by mobile device. Our students, like we, exist in a radically fragmented attention economy, as our senior fellow Matt Crawford has called it. One major effect of the torrent of bits that your students and we all struggle to keep up with is the loss of meaning. What's important? What's significant? How would we know? When confronted with all of it, our students become numb to significance. We lose the thread of the first things. What should we love? For what should we have affection? What should move us to tears or to singing? It's tough to say. So we stick to learning subjects and skills and techniques without bothering with what's worthy of our love. Our students, like we, have become disordered selves. We've become men without chests, in C.S. Lewis's phrase. We're in a real mess. And it probably feels like it's up to you to sort it out, so you can shape and form the rising generation of leaders and contributors, and you're correct. It often is up to you, or it's largely up to you. So the question is, will you retreat? It's a rational desire, but it's not your calling, or you probably wouldn't be in the job that you're in, difficult as it is. But this was Gregory's impulse. When all around gives way, when the center cannot hold, when the circumstances are overwhelming, retreat. Upon his father's death, Gregory converted some of the family properties he had inherited into monasteries. And following his model Benedict, Gregory began following the monastic rule and rhythms of life. He began reading deeply in his theological traditions from his moral sources. He began writing commentaries and treatises and letters. Study was transformed into productivity. Frustration led to fruitfulness. The contemplation of the divine led to the cultivation of the soul. In these bewildering and exciting times, how can you follow Gregory? In fact, I would say you're right where you should be. And I'll encourage you today to stand up to those daunting cultural forces I've mentioned ominously here. Draw on your considerable heritage as a school, as a network of schools, and I know there are a few other schools here as well. You're the inheritor of hundreds of years of cultural and political and economic and theological wisdom. The classical tradition is your set of moral sources. Seek your classical moral source, soak your classical moral sources into your roots. Let them become part of you so you can serve the fruit of your own Western heritage and your attentive learning and your ordered loves to your students tirelessly and inescapably and coherently and winsomely. The leaders of your schools have set out an inspiring mission. At Thales, this is what it says: Thales strives to give students knowledge, to teach students to think on their own, and to give students the tools they need to reach their full potential. Great statement. How will you do this? Through direct instruction and classical curriculum. A classical curriculum with traditional American values, and naturally then, an emphasis on character education. What does that mean? What can motivate your passionate pursuit of this mission? What will motivate your students to excel by cultivating the 15 outcomes of a Thales graduate? My friend and one of our senior fellows at the Institute, Professor Charles Glenn, distinguishes between instruction and education. Instruction is the teaching of knowledge. Education, on the other hand, is the formation of a human being. Instruction doesn't include formation. Formation includes instruction. Formation is about the forging not only of knowledge and skills, but of character and the virtues rooted in strong moral sources. We're also the inheritors of certain basic moral goods that represent real progress over the last few hundred years. These include the dignity of all persons as worthy of universal respect, the freedom to determine one's own life, the free market, and the fundamental right to just relations with institutions and neighbors. While these do not come without their dangers, they're a stable inheritance from the Western tradition upon which we can build. Underlying all these ideals is the relationality of human persons. To quote Zygmunt Bauman, we are ineluctably, existentially moral beings. That is, we are faced with the challenge of the other, which is the challenge of responsibility for the other. Relationships, Bauman says, are shot through with ambivalence because responsibility for one's neighbors has no obvious limits and does not easily translate into practical steps. The practicality of rule-based ethics constrains the moral imagination required to meet our responsibility for our neighbors. Rather, we are challenged to live in such a way that our neighbors can count on us to serve them. To live with such responsibility for our neighbors that we can be counted on by them and accountable before them is to require character, as Paul Ricoeur argued. As its etymology insists, character is the deeply engraved consistency of virtue, of excellence, oriented toward benevolence and justice. By cultivating habits, sensibilities, emotions, allergies, perceptions, and excellences of being a person for the other, virtues are engraved into the soul of the person such that she can be counted on by her neighbors to do what is good and right. And this is human love, to live in self-giving ways that redound to others' bodily, intellectual, spiritual, material, civic thriving, and thus to the human inputs that strengthen a community's thriving. Since becoming a person for the other does not occur automatically, intentional formation of character impresses itself on adults as a basic responsibility toward the young. George Steiner says of teaching that there is no craft more privileged to awaken in another human being powers, dreams beyond one's own, to induce in others a love for that which one loves, to make one's inward present their future. This is a threefold adventure like no other. That is the irreplaceable vocation or role of parents, first and foremost, and also of you as educators, as well as of clergy, coaches, and other adults in your students' lives. So character is a way of being that is deeply etched over time, especially early in life, through habits and actions and decisions, beliefs, emotions, institutions, relationships, commerce, employment, friendships, media, personal reflections, service to others, and innumerable other influences. Character is fundamentally relational, expressed in social bonds as dependability and predictability. A person of good character can be expected to walk in certain predictable ways because of her identity with the good and by habituation of action. Character is the coming together, this is the definition part, the coming together of three formal properties: moral attachment, moral discipline, and moral autonomy. Attachment, discipline, and autonomy. That's the form of character across all societies and cultures. The substance or content of character varies based on religious and philosophical commitments, but it must include moral discipline, which is the ability to say no to temptation. It must include moral attachment, which is a yes to a cause, a creed, or a community outside oneself. And it must include moral autonomy to moral sources, which is responsibility for oneself. The freedom and the self-restraint to say, here I am, to my neighbor who needs me. Attachment, the yes, discipline, the no, and autonomy, the here I am. So given the fact that character is contested in our culture, and adults have a difficult time addressing it, so our research has found, we wanted to understand it, what was happening on the ground in schools as it related to character and citizenship. So a decade ago, we launched a major research project that had two parts. A set of case studies about 10 types of American high schools, and then a major national survey to understand how parents and their teenage kids are thinking about and practicing moral formation in the home. It's a complex study by nearly 20 researchers, and a summary of what we learned about character and citizenship formation among the 10 school types appears in a book called The Content of Their Character, available on Amazon. And then the survey report is called The Context of Character, Teen Moral Formation in the 21st Century. Okay, so here are the 5 major conclusions from this big study. Character must be caught, taught, practiced, and sourced, and those efforts of a school are strengthened or sabotaged by other adult influences, such as parents, clergy, and the like. So I only have time to talk about one of those 5, and so I chose sourced. You have knowledge and wisdom about caught, taught, etc., practiced, I'm sure. So I want to talk about moral sources. And I'm hoping this may inspire you a bit to dig deeper into your classical heritage. Like water from a geyser, character springs from deep sources. Whether we are conscious of them or able to articulate them, deep wells of belief and habit issue forth in the observable behavior and persistent characteristics we call character. These moral sources are an animating faith or philosophy, the picture of the good life to which one holds and at which one's life is aimed. Sources provide motivations for moral action. The basic story of moral sources in the Western world can be told as a shift from outside the self to inside the self. With the Hebrew Bible's narratives of paradise and exile, Plato's conception of the good, Aristotle's notion of flourishing, Jesus' teaching of the kingdom of God, Buddhism's nirvana or Buddhahood, Muhammad's way of submission, the Tao. With all of these, though profoundly diverse, the source of morality, of the good life, was external to the person. Character was something with which one must be in conformity and to which one must be accountable. But in the 17th century, rational enlightenment, René Descartes, shifted from the self that is connected to an external moral source to an autonomous and closed self. Unattached inwardness was essential. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Romantic Enlightenment makes the inner nature the source of morality, meaning that one's self-expression of moral sentiments and feelings was authoritative. Romantic expressivism or emotivism was intensified further by Johann Gottfried Herder, who believed that each individual had a unique way of being. Failing to express and to be true to this unique way of being was to do violence to the person, to be inhumane. Thus, we find the truth within us, according to this way of thinking, and we are concerned to protect those feelings and the sentiments of others, for others. So amid this sea of possible moral sources, what are yours at Thales academies and your other schools? The answer of your well-crafted mission statement is classical. That is, the Greeks and Romans of antiquity and the traditions built upon them, diverse as they are, and including the American tradition. So from the Greeks and the Romans, the Western world received foundational values that remain at least important enough to be contested in American culture today. And since you're returning to first principles in this conference, I'll use the ancient concept of the trivium to summarize those classical moral sources. Trivium is a simple Latin word that means, as many of you will know, an intersection of three roads. From the medieval period, the trivium has been an educational concept meaning the three basic subjects or phases of education versus instruction: grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. These three elements are present in ancient educational praxis, as can be seen in classical Greek, Hellenistic, and Roman literature, as well as in archaeological and inscription evidence from these periods. The Greeks emphasized what they called enkoukleos paideia, which basically means a complete or well-rounded education. Enkoukleos paideia likely originated with Aristotle, and it's attested in Philo of Alexandria. The images Philo uses of education proceeding toward the development of wisdom are of progressing toward an entrance hall in a house, leading to a staircase one climbs, and of suburbs leading to a central city. These entryways to wisdom are grammar, geometry, astronomy, rhetoric, music, and every other thing befitting logic, he says. Note the presence of the three trivium subjects and part of the quadrivium, minus arithmetic. The 81st century educationist Quintilian described subjects that should be covered before the rhetoric stage as part of the orbis doctrinae, the well-rounded teaching: reading and writing, grammar, logic, literature, astronomy, geometry, and the theory of music. Cicero and Seneca are similar. The picture from these authors comports with the archaeological evidence. Writing exercises that students did on papyrus or shards of pottery, wooden tablets, and parchment that have been found by archaeologists attest to this in places like Greco-Roman Egypt, and Italy, especially in Pompeii, and the Near East, Dura Europos and Palmyra. There was a broadly fixed core of texts and practices in antiquity. This approach would be replaced for hundreds of years by such lights of the Western tradition as Isidore of Seville and the Venerable Bede. Alcuin of York adapted classical education and wrote to Charlemagne this: "If only there were many who would follow the illustrious desire of your intent, perchance a new, nay, a more excellent Athens might be founded in Frankland. For our Athens, being ennobled with the mastership of Christ the Lord, would surpass all the wisdom of the studies of the academy. That was instructed in the Platonic disciplines and had fame for its culture in 7 arts. But ours, being enriched beyond this with the sevenfold plenitude of the Holy Spirit, would excel all the dignity of secular learning." The original classical part of classical education was picked up by another classicist, Thomas Jefferson, as well as by Benjamin Franklin, and then eventually by a British medievalist in the 20th century, Dorothy L. Sayers, who advocated that we, quote, turn back the wheel of progress some 400 or 500 years to the point at which education began to lose its true object towards the end of the Middle Ages, and Winston kind of referred to that. Sayers argued that, quote, the trivium was intended to teach the pupil the proper use of the tools of learning before he began to apply those tools to various subjects. Take language as an example. The students learn the vocabulary and the structure, then how to use it and define terms and make accurate statements, and then to express language elegantly and persuasively. My addition to Sayers would be this. Certainly, we need to teach students to use the tools of learning, but because of our historical moment, which I defined as a post-authority moment in a radically fragmented attention economy with disordered selves, we must at the same time create a coherent irresistible culture of learning through three habits and virtues that are rooted in classical moral sources and that correspond to the elements of the trivium. So let me explain this, and I'll draw here on the renowned classicist Victor Davis Hanson, who collected several of these examples. So first, grammar. In antiquity, the grammar stage included learning to read and write characters in Latin and or Greek and or a local language such as Hebrew, memorizing vocabulary and working with passages from Homer, Euripides, Isocrates, Menander. Students wrote lessons on papyrus such as grammatical exercises, morphological tables, parts of speech, the practices of interpreting literature, conjugating verbs and declining nouns, exploring the origins of words, case usage, demonstrating stylistic excellence in the length of syllables, accent usage, and tone. Grammar was important for understanding literary texts, for speaking and for writing, and speaking and writing had to conform to standards of reason, of antiquity, of authority from poets and historians and usage. The grammar stage was focused on a free consensus, on the basics of education, skills such as reading and writing, awareness of linguistic structure, knowledge of basic facts and texts that would easily be accessible throughout one's life in the mind, and familiarity with a particular set of texts. The grammar stage requires memory, honed through the virtue of faith, or more generically, meaning. Intellectual modesty and humility are required to submit to the historical archive, to the tradition that transcends oneself. By taking in and digesting and ruminating on facts, phrases, and ordered fragments of knowledge deemed important by historical consensus, a student gives precious time to submit to a tradition. That which is ingrained in one's memory is then available in the next phases of education and indeed throughout life. Building and then accessing memory is the personal habit that empowers the yes of character. By implanting in a student a tradition through memory, a coherent set of narratives and poems and mathematical ideas and historical dates and biographical sketches and geographical data and so on, the student attaches to a tradition, to a creed, to an intellectual and moral community that transcends, but nonetheless is rooted in particular times. It is thus in the act of remembering, of putting back together the parts that one has memorized in the affirmation of ideals or a person worthy of worship, of ascribing worth, as the Old English has it. This motivates uncoerced moral action of character. Memory and remembering thus lead to faith, to meaning that grounds one's ability in ultimate being and ultimate reality. As a young person, a tradition that one may not yet be able to affirm or to attach oneself to because it is beyond comprehension, one practices mimetically by imitating those who ascribe worth to the tradition or community or creed, in a way maieutically as a midwife would birth a completely helpless child. The Greeks believed in the supremacy of culture. Nearly anyone could be a Greek, could learn the language, could love the right literature, could adopt the same values, could participate in the polis. Which part of the Mediterranean world you came from didn't matter. You could be Hellenized by being enculturated. This is a challenge to a post-authority civilization in which we live. We live in a time when reason and revelation are rendered inadequate as grounds for moral action or arbitrating truth. Those are external standards that may violate my own happiness, comfort, or prejudices, the sentiment goes. It's painful to learn by heart, to memorize, to recite, as your students probably know. And it's pointless if what I'm supposed to be learning in the grammar stage has no authority or importance. Why am I learning this? Your Greek moral sources will tell you that human nature is constant through time, that human beings, for all their glory, are tragic creatures with almost unlimited potential in fateful tension with proclivities toward vice. Think of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, about how fickle human beings are. Reflect with Thucydides about his horror over the Thracians massacring women and children of Mykolaisos, and especially the terrible scene of children being butchered in a school, or Euripides' Medea, or the Phaedra, or degenerate constitutions in Aristotle. The Greeks trusted the average citizen and common sense, favoring neither rich nor poor. Constitutional and consensual government was a Greek notion. Why? Because a tyrant or a set of elites shouldn't be trusted to get it right. Only by deliberation, by finding a common view based on lived experience, could the right policies and practices be found. This is epistemic modesty. So standing against the rejection of reason and revelation in humility and attachment to the moral sources of the classical tradition, we memorize, we recite, we affirm, we attach, we midwife the character of the young people in our care. We give them a yes that they can say and live and practice and identify as their own. They will remember the grammars you taught them if you instill the virtue of intellectual modesty and humility and hone their practice of learning by heart, of submitting, of attaching, of mimesis, imitation, and then of helping them to see the connection between what they believe and say and what they do, their behavior. There are many resources in our classical tradition about this because the notion that words and deeds must match, this is the virtue of honesty and integrity. These are thoroughly Greek ideas. Such for grammar, or maybe the early grades. On to logic or dialectic. Both Philo and Quintilian call this the science of reason, or the science of conducting a philosophical dialogue. In his Topica, Aristotle defines dialectic as reason that begins from a generally accepted opinion. Hence we have the syllogism, famous from Aristotle's On Interpretation. The focus of this phase is on developing independence and clarity of thought and of expression. The teacher led the student through an arduous exploration of all elements of a text or a problem or a creature so that the student could do the same for himself when the teacher was not present. In this phase, the student begins to develop his own thoughts about a text, about an argument or a train of thought, or about a solution to a problem. Although these thoughts are not likely expressed uniquely or creatively at this stage, they represent a student discerning for herself the deficiencies or strengths of an argument. Quintilian pictures this as the process of a student helming his own ship. Plutarch likens the successful student to a bee. Here's what he says. The bee by nature finds the smoothest and best honey in the most bitter flowers and sharpest thorns. He will learn somehow to extract something useful and helpful, even from works which are suspected of being immoral or inappropriate. Or the student is a successful climber who toils up a steep mountain and meets an easier gradient and richer soil. And if by perseverance, Philo says, of study, he pass even beyond these gentler slopes, fruits for which none have toiled thrust themselves upon him, and all things spring forth unforbidden. This is educational progress indeed. What this requires is attentiveness based on cultivation of the virtue of what Aristotle called phronesis, good judgment or prudence, which flourishes when it is oriented by hope and purpose. This stage is not excelled by means of fragmented attention or by accepting any argument or solution. It is at this stage that the know of moral discipline engages. Shall I pursue this? Is that right? What about the truth of this? No. Some of the material I'm studying does not fit the attachment. Discernment and judgment are required. Attentiveness to what is outside ourselves is requisite. Defining, comparing, categorizing, reconsidering, all requiring close attention. What will draw us out of the dark mirror? Moral discipline cultivated by attentiveness through practice of phronesis, expressed in hopeful purpose. Draw deeply from the moral sources of our classical tradition the very notion of dissent and open criticism of government, of religious institutions, of the military, and in fact civilian leadership of the military. These are all from Greek sources. Read Sophocles' Antigone, a speech from Thucydides, Plato's Apology, the Bacchae of Euripides, Josephus' autobiography or Demosthenes' speeches. All over the place we see individual protest, criticism, and free inquiry. Why stare hopelessly and helplessly into a dark mirror? Things can change. Thought deserves criticism. Discipline can be exercised despite the weakness and frailty, indeed because of the weakness and frailty of the human condition. Nurture the judgment in your students, drawn from the moral sources of the classics. And finally, wrapping up here, rhetoric. The rhetoric stage involves, in Quintilian's estimation, the learning of techniques and arts that are useful in law courts and in the government, and we would say today, business. He says the orator must strive to perfect his eloquence and to be a good person, because if he is skillful, he will be able to influence the minds and the bodies of the audience. Ancient educators had their students paraphrase and rewrite Homer and other epic myths, alter narrative sequences based on certain goals, retelling stories with different syntax and structure. These exercises allowed a student to articulate for himself what he had learned in his own words and style, while at the same time placing himself in a tradition from where he lived, in his language, in his time. What would be said and how it would be spoken depended entirely on the audience, on the goals, on the moment to determine what was appropriate. Dorothy Sayers argued that the rhetoric stage corresponded with the poetic age of child development. She said, "The poetic age is popularly known as the difficult age. It is self-centered. It yearns to express itself, rather specializes in being misunderstood." I relate to that. It is relentless and tries to achieve independence. And with good luck and good guidance, it should show the beginnings of creativeness, a reaching out toward a synthesis of what it already knows, and a deliberate eagerness to know and do some one thing in preference to all others. It's telling that Dorothy Sayers, who did much to revive interest in the trivium, was a creative artist. She translated Dante. She wrote the Lord Peter Wimsey murder mysteries. She wrote advertising copy for years, including for Guinness. She wrote an essay called The Mind of the Maker, in which she argued that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is an analog for the human creative process. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit correspond, she argued, to the idea, energy, and power of the artist's creative process. So the rhetoric stage is about imagination being cultivated through the virtue of love or belonging. It requires that the student learn to serve a creative craft or a capacious vision as a response to a need or goal that has as its end the flourishing of the other. The habit that we must instill then is creativity and entrepreneurship, not only novel and responsive ideas, but also ones that serve, ones that meet needs. This is the here I am part of character formation that instills moral autonomy. True, free, vibrant rhetoric is personalized and responsive based on the proper ordering of loves in the soul. Character education itself can claim a beginning in the West some 2,800 years ago, when what we would call middle-class farmers took responsibility for handing down, through hard work and a culture of freedom, a cultivated piece of property to their next generation. It was from this seedbed that such a culture flourished that we received in the model of the polis, the city, the community that was dedicated to the flourishing of as many citizens as possible. Indeed, the institution of private property and the need for free economic activity are Greek concepts. Often private property and free enterprise are characterized as fundamentally selfish activities, but this isn't the whole story. As Greek farmers demonstrate, private property has a time dimension, consideration of the next generation. Except in rare cases, enterprise requires a customer, a beneficiary of the product or service, so it requires creatively working with old ideas and concepts and reactions to solve problems, or find new ways to solve old problems. The Greeks also strove for military superiority through advanced technology, through exceptional discipline, a preference for decisive conflict, and the substantial application of capital to warfare, even as there was a broad distrust of militarism and concern to creatively defend their picture of what is the good life and culture that sustained it. So, our students do not exist only for themselves. They live in a world that has needs that they can meet in creative, innovative ways. And the Greeks demonstrate this with their agriculture, with their economies, with polis culture, with the academies in innovative warfare and technology and tactics and so on. What will order our loves in the torrent of information bits? The students excelling in the rhetoric stage can craft and create and convey ideas and activities in the world that respond to needs and benefit others in self-giving ways. So much for the reflections on the moral sources of classical education through the trivium. So now I would encourage you to do everything you can to create a strong, coherent, thick school culture by fostering the attachment to the classical treasures you've inherited, to resist being disordered selves in a radically fragmented attention economy inhabiting a post-authority civilization. How can you possibly do that with everything else that you have to do and with the cultural forces you're up against? Renew yourself in the moral sources of classical education. Study the trivium. Consider the sources and stories I've mentioned today. Behind these principles and summaries are authors on whose works you could fast for a career. Homer, Hesiod, Livy, Euripides, Sophocles, Thucydides, Thales, Herodotus, Euclid, Aeschylus, Hippocrates, Plutarch, and many more. Remember this tradition. Draw on this tradition. Sink your roots deep into it. Find ways of studying it together and deepening your knowledge of it. It's your heritage, and it's yours to transmit to your students who yearn to share it. Recall our new friend Gregory. Gregory retreated to the monastery to study, to contemplate, to pray, but only for 2 years. Almost as soon as he'd settled into the contemplative life that he'd yearned for, he was called back into service by the Pope as the diplomat to the Byzantine Emperor Tiberius II. And then, at around age 50, in 590, Gregory became Pope Gregory I, or Gregory the Great. And he served as Pope until his death in 604. He fought off the threat of a foreign power. He dealt with the disastrous effects of a major plague. He led liturgical innovations. He expanded the influence of the rule of Benedict. He evangelized large parts of Britain and Europe. And he made some major improvements in the management of the church's extensive land holdings. How did he stay connected to the moral source throughout his very active life that drew on his considerable administrative, diplomatic, and leadership gifts? This is the problem of the vita activa, the active life, and the contemplative life that has been reflected on in our time by Hannah Arendt. For Gregory, the key was living a mixed life, taking the lessons and dispositions of the contemplative life into one's activities. This he achieved by regularly retreating, shutting out busy, urgent, demanding activity to nurture his soul, and by cultivating friendships with colleagues, as Winston mentioned is the goal of this conference, who would encourage him and provide him examples of who he aspired to be, so that in his exhaustion he could follow their pattern. This is your challenge in the confounding cultural times in which we live, to resist the sweep of impoverished influences by nurturing your personal and professional soul in the moral sources of your institution at Thales, in the rich classical tradition that you've inherited, perhaps through the structure of the trivium I've outlined here. Reflect that tradition more and more in your personal conduct. Do everything you can to contribute to a school culture that attracts students to join your way of life, and in the process shape their soul with the virtues of faithful, meaningful humility. Attached to the tradition of hopeful, purposeful attentiveness, disciplined by that attachment, and of loving creativity, responsive in service to the needs of others. Thank you.